sectors, maritime, talk about aviation, talk about road transport, both passenger and freight. And amidst the technical skills training, where we're talking about hard skills, for example, to run what a job requires in automation or electric buses or automated ships. We also think that it's critical to do the soft skills. Most times you find employers, governments, and our training institutions will equip workers with the hard skills. But we've discovered that the soft skills place the worker in a better position to actually manage the workplace better, because soft skills are, for example, for communication, see how to deal with the fellow workers, to also be proactive in the workplace by being problem solving. Those soft skills are critical in our move to decarbonize the transport system, because right now, coming out of the COVID situation, we've discovered that most of our workers, our members, have had lots of mental health issues, lots of health and safety issues being reported. Now, how are we dealing with this? Some of these need support mechanisms that right now are not built up or are not set up very well. And now we're talking about the same people getting into uptaking the new technologies that are needed. So this skilling needs to be framed within a workplace that recognizes the needs of placing what we call a 21st worker, 21st century worker, who is prepared from the human perspective to uptake the mechanical skills. The other thing we think is that in order to make this skills upskilling workable, I think we need to be deliberate in the sense that we don't make it a burden to the workers, the burden to the unions, in the sense that they'll need maybe to pay financial costs, or they may need to take unpaid leaves to get the necessary trainings. We think that we need to have the employers, the governments actually meet the costs of the training, also give time off for the workers to uptake these skilling training courses. We have staggering numbers when it comes to actual numbers. Just last week here in the COP, a maritime just transition task force that was created last year in Glasgow put out certain numbers. They have 3 scenarios, but all in all, at the end of 2030, for example, well, to attain to a zero carbon shipping, we think we shall need a training of not less than 1.2 million seafarers. And this is big. And for it to be meaningful, and for it to actually attain the kind of momentum we need, the workers need to be at the center through their representations of maybe the trade unions. And that's why for us as ITF, we've gone ahead to try and start developing material and policies that can translate some of this thinking into workplace actual trainings. And at the end of this, I'll give you some of the materials we've developed. For Africa, we know there's quite a lot of informality. Actually, most cities are powered by informal transport services. Now, you get to a city, it is a two-wheeler, it is a minivan with not a very decent job for the workers. And that's what we have. So what we're doing is conduct what we call labor impact assessments, especially for the introduction of bus rapid transit. We've done it in now about 5 cities: Nairobi, Kampala, Dakar, Accra, and right now we're doing one in Abidjan. What we're doing with the labor impact assessment is to increase the understanding of the informal transport workplace. because up to until we started this kind of labor impact assessments in 2017, very little was known of the market structure in the informal sector, the kind of issues in there, the economy in there, such that you found that when the BRT started in Bogota, in Africa, in South Africa, workers were fighting the system. And at times, actually, even the World Bank used to think for us transport workers were against the introduction of mass transport systems. No, what we want is inclusion. What we want is to be at the center of informing the process. So, moving forward, we're thinking that we're getting from participation or inclusion from uninformed position. And that's why we're conducting labor impact assessments, which are getting us to a nearly very good place to have scientifically developed issues brought to the table that describe the issues within the informal sector, that describe the pathway they propose for the transition. You go to Nairobi, for example, for them they're looking at sanitation, they're looking at facilities for women, because if you're an informal worker, you don't have sanitation facilities. At the same time, you don't have where to put your baby, for example, if you're a mother. So the labor impact assessments are becoming a tool for knowledge for both policy development and also workplace action. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, you have touched upon many things. You have touched upon workers at the urban level, soft skills versus hard skills that are relevant. You have especially also touched upon the reskilling that is required in the shipping sector. So maybe this is the transition now to you, Camille. Maybe you can tell us a bit more about what is required specifically in the shipping sector and what is the challenge there in order to meet the requirements and make the transition happen to 2050.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you, John, for this introduction, because indeed many of the points you touched upon I agree with. And talking about shipping, because I work for the International Maritime Organization, as other sectors, the gap is huge to decarbonize shipping. As a sector, consume million tons of fuel every year. And in order to get to zero, you can imagine the size of the challenge. But that also has an impact. This transition has an impact on the workforce. 2 million seafarers across the world enable these ships to run and service the economy and provide this so important service to transport goods and persons on the sea. Shipping represents across 3% of global emissions, and the International Maritime Organization, as a global regulator, is striving to, again, address this problem through a number of initiatives, and the most important part of it being developing regulations that apply to ships on the safety dimension, but also in the environmental protection, and particularly in the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from ships. If you take concrete examples from transitions that happened in shipping, you started to see LNG-fueled vessels coming into the water 10, 15 years ago. And this had to come with appropriate rules, both for the safety of the ship, in design and operation, and also obviously for the training of seafarers for improved qualifications for seafarers. And this will continue to be the approach of the IMO to develop both technical and training standards when it comes to the future fuels. And we are talking here about hydrogen-based fuels, methanol, ammonia, which will propel future ships. We are undertaking a review of our main convention that addresses training standards for seafarers, in particular to actually respond to shipping decarbonization, which is one of the main challenges of this industry. I may talk about also other IMO initiatives, which also really aim at driving this decarbonization in this sector, and just transition and the important role of the maritime workforce is an integral part of it. We are currently in the process, our member states are in the process of reviewing our strategy, greenhouse gas strategy, and we will discuss in December during a session of our Environment Protection Committee proposals to actually embed the just transition into this future very important policy framework for the decarbonization of this sector. And we've actually started also to engage in this conversation. We organized a symposium recently where we had a specific session on the just and equitable transition, especially looking into the role of seafarers. IMO is a member of the Maritime Just Transition Task Force, which John mentioned. They've done amazing work in actually reflecting these issues in order to enable a human-centered decarbonization of shipping. And indeed, the technological changes come hand in hand with the human element and improved skills. So just to say that in the revision of the strategy, we see more and more proposals to actually seize opportunities of shipping decarbonization to not only indeed close this gap we have, this emission gap, but also improve the seafarers' working condition, but also the livelihood of maritime communities, seize opportunities for producing alternative fuels in countries, in particular developing countries, and hopefully as well improve the connectivity of these communities that are highly dependent on maritime transport, such as small island developing states. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, now we have some understanding gained from the shipping sector, the international shipping sector. Maybe let's now move to the other end of the scale, which would be urban mobility. Leonard, could you maybe give us some insights of what the Just Transition Challenge looks like on the urban sector?
Yeah. Maybe, maybe not, yes. Yeah, definitely. It's a very different ballgame, obviously, urban mobility. Much lower masses of stuff you want to move around. But the challenges are just as big, if not bigger, in the urban mobility space, because about 70% of transport emissions are in cities, and that's a huge challenge we need to tackle. There's hundreds and thousands of people involved in planning, operating public transport in all the cities around the world, and the problem is getting bigger because people are moving more and more towards the cities, meaning that we need more efficient ways and more sustainable ways to get around. If we put that in the context of a just transition, to me, that means that you don't just provide a sustainable way of getting around, but it's all the other factors as well. It's an equitable, it's sustainable, and it needs to be affordable, but as well safe. And those factors together mean that you can't just put everybody in an electric vehicle and let them drive to work, because that's, well, neither equitable because it's very expensive, it's not affordable, and it's not sustainable because we need so many electric cars, we'll never be able to produce them, nor should we want to produce them. And that means that if you put everybody in an electric car, you might have everybody safe, but all the other elements we're missing. So that to me is not a just transition. And that's where active mobility and public transport together, so walking and cycling, public transport together, can provide a real solution. Walking, cycling, and public transport are the only modes that get better if more people use them. If more people get in a car, the traffic jam gets longer. If more people get on a bus, you might be able to upgrade it to a tram. You might be able to increase the frequency and thus make it better and more usable for more people. At the Transport Decarbonization Alliance, where we're, as Mobicon, we're a member of, we acknowledge that the role of active mobility is still undervalued in the whole system. We just saw some huge figures of investment needed in the electric vehicle sphere, in the maritime shipping sphere, in the aviation sector, 40, 50 billion a year. Active mobility is insanely cheap compared to that, and that's an aspect that we often forget. We look for the shiny big thing that's gonna, make all the Teslas in the world, give everybody a Tesla and we'll solve it. It's gonna cost a lot of money. Active mobility is not just cheap for people operating it, because a bicycle is, $50, but it's also very cheap to build. And the strange thing now that we see in the transport funding world is that there is plenty of funding around. Everybody says money is no longer an object, but everybody's looking for big ticket item investment opportunities. And then in that sense, active mobility is sometimes just too cheap to be funded in a global sense, which is a real shame, so something we need to address. On the other side, and I'll keep that short, the just transition for active mobility also means retraining our traffic engineers. Because we've got hundreds of thousands of traffic engineers that are really good at building beautiful motorways. I don't know if anybody coming in on the plane, you saw the giant cloverleaf 10-lane motorway intersection. Beautiful piece of engineering, but those are not the same skills that we need to build good active transportation networks that link in well with the public transportation and can really leverage of each other. And that kind of understanding and capacity building takes a long time, especially because there's so many people involved. There's literally thousands and thousands of people that need to be retrained in that sphere as well. So we really need to find a good path forward that not just allows our traffic engineers to build proper cycleways, but also allows our policymakers to understand the opportunity, understand the giant economic benefits of this kind of low-level investment and appreciate the super low-hanging fruit that everybody's overlooking on the way to a fully electrified car fleet. So that's the key aspects that we're focusing on in the Transport Decarbonization Alliance at the moment.
Excellent, thank you. And now I would have actually hoped that our representative from ICAO is already here. And I think she is. Perfect. This is no problem. It's just stressful for you, I guess, to come into the panel and to immediately be asked a question. However, I will go ahead because this would be the perfect flow, so I will continue. So we have now heard from an African perspective, especially focusing on the workers, what a just transition to a zero carbon transport system actually means. We have heard from the IMO representative what it means for shipping. We have heard from a representative from the urban transport system what a transition in urban transport would actually mean. Now I would like to come to the aviation sector, obviously the sector that has been missing so far. And here I would like to introduce by saying that we obviously know that the ICAO assembly has taken place. A long-term aspirational goal has been defined. And it would be brilliant if you could let us a bit more about this, what this actually means, where it came from, what the achievement was, so that we have a basic understanding of where the aviation sector is currently headed to. Thank you.
So, thank you for the invitation to start with. Good afternoon to all. It's a pleasure to be here, mainly when we come bearing very good news to everybody, right? We just had our assembly in ICAO. ICAO is the International Civil Aviation Organization. We are a UN specialized organization with 193 member states. And in our last assembly 1 month ago, we were just able to align the objectives of international aviation with the temperature objectives of the Paris Agreement, with the net zero, and those are very good news. It was not the first time we put goals for international aviation. Our first goals were set 12 years ago in 2010. That was the carbon neutral goal from 2020. It's funny that now we talk about net zero 2050, but 12 years ago, that was one of the biggest ambitions that were around, was carbon neutral 2020. But a lot happened, and the important thing for us is to see the power of setting those goals. Because with the first one, as soon as we set the goal, we had all this synergy just after we were able to put a binding standard for CO2 emissions for aircraft, global one. We created the global offsetting scheme for international aviation, CORSIA, which is the only global offsetting scheme for a sector to maintain the commitment of not passing the bar of the 2020. We also started a lot of work with cleaner energy and sustainable aviation fuels. And now we have so many aircrafts flying around with the sustainable fuels. But we were missing the long term. And the reason we didn't put the long term at the time was that our states required a feasibility study, really showing that that was possible. So that was the work that we did during the last 3 years. 400 of the best experts got together and prepared an open, transparent report that's available on the website. And that was the basis for the decisions on a high-level meeting and in the Assembly. Part of the process, of course, was the discussion with all our countries on the policy side. And from that discussion, and part of our decision and agreement is the recognition that not all states are in the same starting line. So we have states in very different starting line, but we all want to get to the same ending point. That means that the means of implementation have to be differentiated, that we need to put some capacity building there. Of course, we chose to go to the most aggressive scenario to get to the net zero. With this high ambition, we also have to commit with high means of implementation. So it's high capacity building, it's high financing together with that. And I think this is the discussion. We have set up already a big program. We are focusing on SAF, Sustainable Aviation Fuels, because in all the studies that's shown, that's the most promising area that we can go. You have a few states that produce aircraft, and they will continue to produce aircraft and new aircraft, electric, hydrogen. That technology will continue with a few states. But with SAF, we can involve the 193 states. We can have 193 states producing SAF. I just came from a WEF event, sorry to be late, and there WEF, which is one of the partners that we have in the Act SAF, so we have financial institutions, the industry, all states, they are announcing 300 plants by 2030 as a means of getting on track for that fuel. We have 193 states. Let's just imagine we have one plant in each of our states, you know? And the good thing with the SAF is it's not one fits all. You can really build on the vocation of each state. So for some states, the agriculture states, they can have secondary productions, or they can have waste as a source. In Europe, they are really looking into power to liquid. So doesn't matter how you go about it, you can be contributing, you can be part of it. And that engagement to all of the states now, it's a reality that we can pursue, right? So I think that was one of the most important decisions that came from the last Assembly.
Thank you, excellent. That's a good summary, and I think it provides some of the main understanding for us to see what in the aviation sector is happening. Now I would like to open a second round of questions, and maybe I start with you again, Mark, more on the terms of what are the specific, would be your specific wish to the policymakers in order to drive the just transition for Africa, for the transport workers? You have mentioned, for example, that impact assessments are super relevant and they have to be pushed further. What is it what you would be asking the policymakers more specifically? This is the key item that you need to regulate, that you need to push in order to make it easier for the workers.
Thank you very much. I think I'll pick from where she said where we would think of having some of these things in every country. And for us, part of the process should start with setting up certain structures. For maritime right now, we're thinking about the Maritime Skills Councils at national level, with workers involved, with employers, with government, such that that becomes the think tank for developing the skills needed, the assessment needed, and uptaking whatever gaps that will be needed for the just transition. Because just like my sister is saying, there's no one size fits all, okay? every country, every community will need its own, but we need to build a certain structure that can help those communities develop a socially just transition, a fair way of getting to the place we want. The same we're thinking about also in the maritime, in the aviation, developing the just transition committees at a national level, but with all the constraints involved, just like we have the tripartite of the ILO, because we need this thing to be cascaded down. I know here things may be not moving, but at country level things can move. But we need to have the countries develop the appropriate structures that can push the just transition agenda. I was talking about the informal workers. We've done a little bit of work now in Nairobi, where we have a socially just transition, a socially just public transport forum that is spearheaded by Frederick Ebert Stifton, but brings academicians, bring the workers, and they're trying to think through what a socially just public transport could be. And my brother Leonard was talking about active, how did you put it? Active mobility. In Africa, for example, we grew up walking. We grew up walking to school, walking to hospitals, walking everywhere. We grew up riding. But now, the people who grew up walking and riding are the policy guys. So when they are designing engineers and when they are designing roads, they will never put a walking or a riding space. Why? Because they grew up walking. They don't think it is necessary. So what do we have? Streets full of cars. Because culturally, when you buy a car, it's a status. So we need a different approach, for example, for Africa, for active mobility. Maybe behavioral change communication, so that we get to start to have people thinking about active mobility as a solution, part of the solution to decarbonize our streets. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, you have mentioned now a lot of active mobility, so probably most more convenient if I pass right over to Leonard. What would be your policy wish, the one thing that the policymakers should be doing to facilitate your work?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's two parts to that answer. One is facilitate that knowledge exchange, and that already it happens on a relatively, well, on a good scale, but not good enough for the severity of the issue. So the Dutch Cycling Embassy is doing a lot of capacity building regionally, but it's always requiring external funding, and that needs to be found, et cetera, et cetera. It would be really good if we could set up a global system for knowledge exchange where we not only get knowledge from the countries like Denmark and the Netherlands that have traditionally been good at cycling infrastructure, but blend that with local knowledge, because there's still great designers of streets and stuff in Africa and in Asia and in every region of the world. But we need to bring those people together so people can learn from each other, and that needs to be centrally funded. So money shouldn't be an object to gaining knowledge about walking and cycling. We recently, or actually tomorrow officially, we'll launch the call to action in the Dutch pavilion on this particular topic, where we're asking for $100 million to start up a training program for 10 years where we can train 10,000 professionals globally in walking and cycling. I think that's a good start. It's still not enough. We probably need to double that and then double it again to make any decent change. But that will be step one. Make sure everybody around the world has equitable access to the best practice knowledge, so we don't end up with, nice attempts at cycling infrastructure. I'm not naming names, but there's a few cycleways around here that may not be up to standard yet. Make sure that knowledge is really readily available to anyone who wants it. So that's step one. And then step two is to really, like I said in the previous session, or the previous question, really acknowledge the role of walking and cycling, and really say we don't have time enough to just hope for a technological solution that will help us. Yes, you can start building a tram now, but we need stuff done before 2030. Walking and cycling can literally be done almost overnight and acknowledge the scale of the problem and the opportunity that walking and cycling can give to have really low-hanging fruit, cheap, quick and dirty interventions that make big changes in people's lives tomorrow and not in 2030.
Okay, excellent, thank you. So a lot of emphasis on knowledge sharing. Camille, maybe let's go to the other end of the spectrum again, to international shipping. So obviously you're representing policymakers, so I will not ask the question in terms of what your wish to policymakers is. I would rather phrase it as, what is your plan in terms of making this work with the countries? I mean, obviously you have your challenges as well in order to bring all these countries together and on the same page, but I think you as IMO probably have a strategy of what you will do in order to make this work in the next years.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. Well, climate change is definitely a priority for the International Maritime Organization as well. I think Jane rightly pointed out the importance of setting goals, of setting a clear pathway to drive the decarbonization of the industry. And our two agencies, our two sister agencies, have this in common to actually be regulating a global sector. So among the different work streams which our member states are working on currently, and again we're having a meeting in just a few weeks' time, first of all is the revision of our strategy, and with a view to in particular strengthen its ambition. And we will have a meeting in July next year where we hope to really confirm the commitment of the International Maritime Organization, its member states, to strive towards phasing out greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible in this century. But as you said, it's member states, and it's ultimately obviously for them to decide how to formulate this commitment. But I'm confident that this will confirm the direction towards which the industry has to be moving. And together with strengthened ambition and goals comes measures, and in particular for shipping, mandatory measures that apply to all ships. And we're developing a basket of measures that will combine technical and carbon pricing elements, which is something that will really also drive the change in this industry. International collaboration matters. It's key, especially for a global sector. But we cannot also underestimate the importance of national and local action. John mentioned the National Maritime Skills Council, which I think is a key element to also bring around the table the workforce, seafarers. Their voice has to be heard. And I really also encourage communities to also, and national organizations to use and leverage this through another IMO instrument, which is the national action plans, that can help also developing strategies at the national level to support global goals.
Excellent, thank you. And now maybe back to the aviation sector, maybe you could say a few more words about what the specific challenges now are, in your point of view, to implement the aspirational target, and what you would expect from the member countries more specifically. You have hinted to a few items already, but maybe you could summarize this once more. And
definitely. So together this beautiful agreement that we had in the Assembly comes an enormous responsibility in the implementation. And we have the three streams that I just mentioned on technology, operations, and cleaner fuels. The reason we are really focusing the implementation right now in pushing cleaner fuels is that we think that's the right moment to start it if we want the results at the right time in the path for the 2050 net zero. And if we are talking here about just transition, you know, accessibility is a big part of just transition. Accessibility to markets, accessibility to jobs, accessibility from one country to the other, accessibility to the world. You know, this accessibility word is very important. And under that focus on our next steps, on building the capacity in each state, you have this alignment of stars, of course, in that decision to prioritize cleaner energies, because your association, the environmental benefits with the economic case and jobs, and that is what makes that option such a powerful one. We are creating new markets, we are creating new activities that would feed aviation with the possibility globally of getting to the net zero. An airline from Europe, for example, can leave Europe or North America with sustainable aviation fuels, but when you get to the other side, if you cannot fuel your aircraft to come back with those fuels, it's not okay. So we need everybody producing, and that is the key that we are looking for in the next step. So we have a big conference next year, focus on sustainable fuels, where we will decide this global framework. But make no mistake, when we talk about the global framework, we are talking something that cannot be neither process or feedstock discriminatory. It has to be agnostic on feedstock and processes, allowing for each state to really move forward with its vocation. So our wish for the policymakers, although we are policymakers in general, is that we do not embark into routes that would lead to policies that will be discriminating some processes and some ways of production, because that will then not allow each of the differences that we need to have, multitude of initiatives that we need to have. So this is super important. Transparency is also very important in all the journey, because we have a program called ACT-SAF that we launched that put together industry, financing, states. So states put in their action plans what they need, and we mix and match them with those that can provide the capacity and the financing so that they can move. And as I said, it's very different levels. So some just need to see what their vocation is. So it's a feasibility studies. Other knows what their vocation is. They need the business case. But from this process, what we need to be very attentive is that a lot of the financing in the UNFCCC process is very focused on the NDCs. Those are two sectors that are international, they are not in the NDCs. And if we try to use those funds to help the states to create those opportunities, they are not available for those two sectors. So this is something we have to really look, because this is both good for domestic emissions and international. So we should look attentive to that. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. And you have actually provided a very nice bridge to the second panel, which will discuss the finance questions, and maybe they could then take up also the finance question in terms of aviation and international shipping to see how this could work. So now we have one panel member that hasn't raised her voice yet. She has been very patiently listening. She is our youth representative on the panel. She has been listening to see well, what people have to say, and to kind of make up her mind what her response therefore would be from a youth perspective, and what she would like to see to make sure that just transition in transport works, and also works for the youth and their aspirations. Please, if you could share a few thoughts.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Really good talks by our co-panelists. So I'm going to frame my answer on the basis of what they said, and also what my personal experiences have been in growing up, coming from a developing country, rather say emerging economies, and how wish I could go back and change things differently in order to ensure just transition for the transport sector. So I grew up in a state where there was, every year there was floods, so we always had like rainy days, which had, like holidays for school, and also our parents did not go to jobs, which impacted the economies, obviously, because of the rainy days. So we always keep talking about, yes, the usage of transport is impacting the environment. However, how the climate change is also impacting the transport usage is something that we can think upon. So what I'm meaning to say is the understanding of the emerging economies in terms of climate crisis is very different from the Western world. And this is talking from the perspective of availability of technology, availability of resources, and also, I think, cultural and socio-demographic contexts. So I think as she said, like, we have all very different starting points. I think it's time to change the narrative that in terms of identifying leaders or laggards in accepting new technology, there will always be a difference unless we change the thinking. Because, as I mentioned already, there's always going to be a difference. Secondly, I think our initiatives should be focused on grassroots level initiatives. As Elizabeth, you itself focused initially that we have to have participatory methods, including the vulnerable groups and the communities. So there are studies on neurourbanism, like how the cities impact the people's mental health and stuff, and how their accessibility, like you said, is really important for the economy as well in the cities, and vice versa. And also youth's perspective, which is very important at the moment. As my colleague again said, that active mobility is important. Coming from my country's perspective, something called IPT, intermediate public transport, which are like the three-wheelers, are the unorganized sector, which is also very important. People are not talking about decarbonizing it that such a massive scale at the moment. So I think it's more than decarbonizing, it's actually valuing the livelihoods that they are supporting, which is also important for the just transition. The second and the last probably work that I'm going to emphasize is on the policy and the umbrella work for knowledge exchange. So growing up, one challenge that I faced, and also like coming for the masters abroad, is that there was a very massive knowledge gap from the developing and developed countries' perspective. So I wish we had an umbrella organization of institutions which shared common knowledge levels, that we all could be enthusiastic about innovative solutions, and drive towards innovative solutions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you very much also to be sure to repeat some of the points that each of our panelists have made, which was excellent. I fear we actually have come to the end of our time for this first panel in our event. So I will thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for participating.
Maybe before you wind up, I just had a few documents I wanted to give our lead champion, Angie. If you can, please, can you receive these? We have a document we've just launched here on sustainable transport for Africa. We also have one here for maritime, which was just launched the other day, and then for aviation, just for recognition of our start of our partnership. International Transport Workers Federation wants to work very closely with the Transport Forum.
Excellent.
Thank you
so much, and it shows that you're active on all different levels and subsectors of transport. Thank you. So yeah, thank you again. I will welcome you off the stage now and welcome the new panel on stage. Marusha, please.
Some aspects of our testing according to standards, and that's what we'll focus on today. But before we get into those details, I wanted to talk about solar cookers and the different types of solar cookers. On this slide, you see 3 different types of solar cookers. We might call these the most common types of solar cookers: reflective panel, box oven, and parabolic reflector. All of these devices collect and absorb direct sunlight and retain heat to cook food. These are examples of hundreds of variations of solar cookers. These are solar thermal devices, and there are complementary technologies in the form of heat-retained systems and also water pasteurization indicators, because we are also interested to promote water pasteurization for having clean water to drink, and that can be done using a solar cooker. On this next slide, we see 3 other types of solar cookers that use Fresnel lenses, Fresnel mirrors, and also evacuated tubes. There's a lot of room for creativity in the solar cooking sector. Now, who is Solar Cookers International? SCI is a nonprofit organization that has been leading the solar cooking sector since 1987. We have hundreds of collaborators in over 135 countries. The mission and vision of SCI is to improve human health, economic well-being, women's empowerment, and the environment by promoting climate-friendly solar cooking for vulnerable populations worldwide. How do we work at Solar Cookers International? We are really focusing on the vulnerable populations. So to reach 2.4 billion people still cooking with open fires using firewood and charcoal today, that is not only harmful to themselves, but also harmful to the environment. Solar Cookers International works in 3 ways, meaning our strategic plan has focus on advocacy efforts, such as why we're here at Cop27. Also research through product testing, which we'll be talking about today, according to ISO standards by the International Organization for Standardizations, and also capacity building, to build capacity for solar cooking in various areas where there is greatest need. So, I am glad to have Jyoti here today to talk about measurements and standards. So, as an introduction, Jyoti, could you describe the Nepal Bureau of Standards and Metrology as an introduction and perhaps from a high level?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Alan, for this opportunity, and thank you, Solar Cooker International, to invite me as a speaker here. Yeah, let me tell something about my organization. Yeah, our organization is a Nepal Bureau of Standards and Metrology. It's the NBSM, and we are a national standard body under the Ministry of Industry, Trade, Commerce and Supplies. So we publish national standards, as well as we are a Meteorological Institute, NMI, and we do the testing. We have a testing facility also for some of the products, and we also do the certification work in our country. So we have a accredited lab that is ISO accredited lab 17025 in 76 plus parameters, and our product certification system as well as system certification system is also accredited from NABCB. So we are doing work in the quality infrastructure in Nepal. We are a pioneer institute leading the quality things in Nepal, from publishing of standards to testing to the up to the certification. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jyoti. I want to now go into a little bit of background for why SCI is leading the solar cooking sector through testing. And this story goes back to 2014, where at the SCI World Conference in Sacramento, California, where SCI is based, identified a gap in our sector. And that gap came from that we didn't have standards. There was no internationally agreed upon standard for how to test a solar cooker at that time. It was very confusing for consumers and maybe leaders of large organizations that might want to purchase a large quantity of solar cookers. So we would see on websites of manufacturers claims such as these: award-winning solar cooker, world's #1 solar oven, best solar cooker. What did that mean? That was extremely confusing to the sector. So that there was this gap in testing, that there was no internationally agreed upon standard on how to test cookers, SCI decided to fill the gap. So going forward in that, SCI is a brand agnostic organization, meaning it does not promote one brand over another one. And SCI is no longer a manufacturer. So stepping away from the manufacturing side of solar cookers, we are well positioned to lead a testing program without a perceived conflict of interest. And that's something that we thought was very important. And I think that others also agree. So, Jyoti, how important is it that organizations that test products according to ISO standards not have a perceived conflict of interest? So, as I just described, SCI is no longer a manufacturer in solar cookers, and we felt that that was a good place to be for testing. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes, let me tell something on this from very beginning, something from beginning.
Okay.
Yes, as first we have a standard in place. You have a document standard in place. After that, people come to the any certification organization to certify that this product complies that standard. Normally,
Yes.
maybe that solar cooker, if it gets a standard X, that they want the certification, it is a up to standard X. So for that, this is a very important. We must have a testing facility. We have either it is inside your certification unit, or you have an independent lab that is the traceable to any international systems. It is better if we have a accredited laboratory. Yes, ISO accredited. If not, we must have the pass some guidelines so that that testing is done. Only then can that people or our consumer can rely on us. Without testing, we can't say anything. It's just a verbal thing. That's I am powerful. How much powerful? What is your test result? This is very important. If you are saying that is my, that is, for example, my cement is 33 grade cement. You have to prove it in a 28 days time. You must pass the 33 that result.
Yes.
Similarly, maybe in a solar cooker, if its solar panel heat that is up to 1000 degrees centigrade in a half hour time, it must pass that test, and you must show the test result to convince your consumers. So for any manufacturer or for any one who is doing any type of product making business, they must have tested from the laboratory.
Yes, yes.
Test facility.
Yes, thank you very much for elaborating on that. And I know that you're at the national standards group, and so while there are standards being developed on the international level, there are also standards being developed at the national level. And I was wondering if you could describe, from your experience, what is the process like for Nepal at the Nepal Bureau of Standards and Metrology for developing standards?
Yeah, it's being a government organization, and we have an annual program. Yeah, we have some responsibility to make that number, given number of standard in given fiscal year. Something we also do the research and analysis to which sector we need standards, and that is our standard strategy, that we just revise standards in 5 years time mostly. If any request come to us for any sector, we just do the internal discussion on that, and after that we made a technical committee headed by our Director General with all stakeholders who are on that. If there are any that is alliance companies, that is a you say that is a company, that is a group of people, that is a associations.
Okay,
Yes, mostly.
association.
Yeah, people from association. We can't pick up all the people, so we mostly invite the people, 2 or 3 people from association expert, and we have a series of meeting on that. And yes, like that. And after final meeting, we make one draft standard. So that draft standard goes to the NCS, that National Standard Council, headed by our minister, with many stakeholders from the different organization. And after being discussion on there, this approved from this National Standard Committee. Only then it is get that number you are seeing, that right, NS,
Yes.
that it will get the number NS XYZ. So after then we have a complete document standard, that is first stage is complete. Thank you.
Okay, Jyoti, thank you so much. That process that you just described, I think, is very similar to what happens at the ISO level. And I'll just leave it at that, that it is an opportunity to bring together representatives and delegates from various countries who have expertise in whatever the standard is focusing on. So at Solar Cookers International, we were given some advice, actually, at the time when SCI was looking into how to become a testing facility. And we were made aware of new standards at the ISO level led by Technical Committee 285 to develop standards for clean cook stoves and clean cooking solutions. We were encouraged to join that effort, and since we are a neutral organization, brand agnostic, etc., we joined the US delegation to Technical Committee 285 for the ISO standards. And the good news is that now these standards exist. They were published for laboratory standards and field testing standards in 2018 and 2019 respectively, and now we have these available to go forward with product testing. So on that note, I'd like to describe how we at SCI have put together a platform for testing solar cookers. We have branded this the Performance Evaluation Process, or PEP for short, and this is a testing platform that harmonizes with the new ISO standards for testing clean cook stoves. And that includes a method for testing solar cookers. So we now automate that protocol for measuring what we call the standard cooking power, and it's one number for every solar cooker in terms of watts. So watts is the standard, it's the international standard unit for power, and it's an appropriate unit for measuring the uptake of power in a solar cooker. So this helps you or anyone have informed decisions on which solar cooker might work best for you, and most importantly, this has brought credibility to the solar cooking sector. Here's an image of the inside of that box. So our colleague, Justin Tabachnik at SCI, actually developed this. He designed this. We worked together through many phone calls, and this is now up and running, and we're able to test solar cookers and take the information that we gather through this platform, which measures temperature in the water in a solar cooker, and it compares that temperature with the temperature of the ambient, the air temperature, basically. We look at the solar radiation that's coming in real time while we're doing the test, which gives us a normalization factor so we can compare results from one day to the next day to the next day. That's extremely important. Without that, your values will change because the conditions of the sky change from day to day. We also keep track of wind speed so that we stay within a threshold so that we don't have leakage problems or heat being drawn away from high winds. Now, when we have all that data, we can use very simple freshman level equations from chemistry, also from physics. I say chemistry because Jyoti's a chemist, I'm a physicist. And this just says that power is involving mass, how much of a material, the heat capacity of that material, the specific heat, temperature difference, and then divided by time. And then you get powers. There's really nothing more simple than something like that. So we look at the power values of a solar cooker, the uptake in the water at every 10-minute interval, and then plot them, do a linear regression, and where that line passes the 50-degree temperature difference between the ambient air and what the temperature is in the pot, that is where we define the standard cooking power. And that temperature happens to be about what the onset is of cooking. So this is an appropriate measure for standard cooking power. Now, SCI has not only developed this technology for measuring standard cooking power ourselves, but we have now trained other laboratories and spread the capacity for solar cooker testing in 2 different areas right now, in Nepal and also in Kenya. So we're thrilled to have this capacity spreading to other laboratories. These were already, these groups were pre-existing stove testing centers. So we work with groups that have already expertise in this arena. And as we are now, we've launched our testing program. These are the cookers that we've tested so far. These includes reflective panel cookers, box ovens, and evacuated tubes that are manufactured from the industry, from the sector. This does include the Cookit, which SCI used to manufacture. We no longer manufacture it because it has a life of its own. It's an open source design, and so this can be built by anybody, by students, etc. But these cookers now are listed on our website. We post the standard cooking power for those cookers, but we also have a chart on our website where people can come and visit and find out the exhaustive report of each cooker, and also access the more information about each cooker through a wiki page that we host on our website. Okay, now when a manufacturer approves the report and allows us to give the publication open to the world, we then allow them to have this label where it indicates that that product has been tested by SCI or through SCI equipment that has been approved, and it's tested according to ISO standards. So this is something that we would like you to look for, especially if you're looking to purchase a solar cooker, either for yourself or for your organization if you're going to have a lot of cookers for your initiative. If you're leading an initiative and you're maybe wanting to work with a different cooker, call us, get it tested. We can do that for you. We also encourage the manufacturers to get their products tested because we like to showcase that they've done that, and we are doing that here now. Last week at our exhibit booth, we showcased a couple solar cookers that were PEP tested, and we're excited to continue doing that going forward. We also publish our work. This is a picture of the abstract of a publication that we were able to present this work at the Solar World Congress in 2021. And we will keep being as transparent as possible through these sorts of methods of peer-reviewed publications and sharing our work online. Okay, so that is our work with ISO and our own testing program and the results that we have. So I'd like to ask Jyoti another question, and that is that we feel the standards are important. But I would like to hear it from you. What is the importance of ISO standards in your mind? Just that very simple question. Can you tell us about the importance of ISO standards?
Yeah.
Yeah, just the
Yeah.
overall importance. Of
Yeah,
the
it's it gives us us guideline. So the many people from the world get together, they make conscious decision, and only then we have a ISO standards in place. So every country get standards from them. Being a full member of ISO from 2014, we have been access to the many technical committees. We have been taking part to them for making ISO standards. So this standard helps us to showing the guides how our product to be, what is its scope, from scope to the test, from scope, starting from the scope to the final test, to be for the certification process, to make a scheme for testing and inspection. We say it STI. Yeah, it helps a lot. Without a standard, we do not have guidelines like a syllabus. It's a major thing. It's like a heart in your body.
Yes.
Relying on that standard, that document, whether it is a 4-page or it is a 40-page, yeah, it shows us the guideline. So where to start, how to do, and where we have to do in, yeah. And this mostly that is not a guideline, but a product standard tells about what are the major parameters, what are the tests to be done, what are the performance parameters. So after that all tests gone through them, we have a trust on it. That is it's been very important it is important for the academia, for a researcher, for a scientist, for the yes, everybody can get benefited. Yeah, for the to obtain the SDG goals and many things, to have a clean water, to have a clean energy. It's associated with everywhere. I think to manage many things. Yeah, it's just it's waving everywhere.
Thank you for elaborating on that. And we agree with you. Without standards, there's confusion, but with standards, we can work together. There are
Yeah,
guidelines.
we have a specific standard for the
Yeah.
specific product. So
Yeah.
if you want to have a 43 grade cement, you have a that is specific standard. If you want a NS pipe, black pipe, you have NS 40 standard. Yeah, we have a separate all that. It gives us a clear vision.
Yeah.
Yes.
So one thing that we at SCI try to do is reach out to our manufacturers in our sector and encourage them to have their products tested. And there are still manufacturers out there who have not had their products tested. So we think that if they get their products tested, this can help drive the sector, business, and it would be good for them. Can you elaborate on that from your role about ISO standards? How can they drive product development and drive the market for tested products?
Yeah, thank you. It's a very important question. Yeah, product to be tested. If this is a performance parameter, if it is a, there are many types of tests. So you can do, that is a, this type test once in a year. Some tests you have to do once in a 6 months, and some are the regular tests you have to do in a regular basis, in a from batch to batch. So testing is very important. Without testing, you can't say that my product is up to that standard. If your standard, that is document standard, tell you about the anything just from a small test to the that is a sophisticated tested. Maybe sometimes you just need a length, breadth, height testing, volume testing, or like that. Or sometimes you must have to go to the that is a special instrument test. Like you have to, if you do the antibiotic test or any residual test, you have to go through the SPLC or GC-MAS test also.
Indeed.
Yeah,
Yes, yes.
but we are here, I think, telling about something power. So we must have the good electrical laboratory, electrical testing center to match the parameters which we are going to for that specific product.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate your comments. And we have another question here about the countries and their nationally determined contributions. So while we're interested in clean cooking and clean cook stoves, how can standards help countries reach their NDC goals? And I understand that you might have a wider perspective, but what is the importance of the ISO standards to help countries reach their goals for their nationally determined contributions?
Thank you for this question. So from Paris Agreement, all people in the world, we are telling that we will keep the temperature 1.5 degree or below 2 degrees centigrade. But situations are alarming. Emissions were high, our that is our mountains, our glaciers are melting. So we are not gonna get a result if we are not giving the going to the net direction. So for in our NDC in Nepal, we also told that we will reach to net zero by 2045. Yes. 45, but our rural people, you have been working in our country, Nepal. Yes, our rural community is always now is based on a wood fire on that. So we have to shift wood fire and this type of things to the clean energy in the transport. Yeah, we need a support in the transformation of transportation sector to the green sector. To all type of energy to the green energy, because we are very much we have that is resource of hydropower. So we have we have resource. So our country wants to go to the transform all type of energy to the green energy, and we are working on that. Yeah, our NDC tells like that. So it's very important to have to reach the net zero. With the standard, without a standard, we are like in a dilemma. Yeah,
Yes.
it will give us the clear direction.
Indeed. I know you mentioned to me earlier that a way for an organization like SCI to help a country, encourage them to adopt ISO standards, would be through communication channels with writing letters through the government testing bureaus to those who actually would be able to adopt the standards at the high level. I want to introduce a new work item at the ISO level, and I'm excited to show this because these are pictures from Nepal. There's a new work item that was introduced by the country of Uganda, that there's a need for institutional level cook stove standards for institutional level cookers, and this happens to be a school called the Vajra Academy in Nepal that has an institutional solar steam system on its roof, where sun is concentrated to receivers, where water is heated to steam. The steam is transported downstairs through plumbing, and inside this clean kitchen, momos are made, and they are extremely delicious. So we're excited about that. How can you? What can you do to help? So how to engage with SCI? We have a number of ways to engage, but please contact us, and we'd be happy to work with you. You can also consult SCI if you're needing assistance for standards testing, products testing. Please reach out to us. We'd be thrilled to have you, to help you. Now, we do have a couple more events here at Cop27, where we have been meeting so many people and very excited about the relationship building that we've been having. But finally, thank you. Thank you all for being here, for listening, for tuning in. We really appreciate that you can learn more about product testing and also how SCI works with other countries. We thank our supporters, and again, thank you very much. Okay, thanks. Thank you, Jyoti. Thank you very much. That was fantastic. We're going to take pictures off to the side here.
Side is very different, and a lot of that can be fixed through structures, through policies, through other financial instruments, but that capacity, I think, does not exist, and we've got to come a little bit closer. The private commercial money, public cash, a little bit closer to public mobility, in this case mobility, but this sort of structures, for us to just cross over, for that capital to come in now and make the kind of more sophisticated market that is needed.
Excellent. Well, Uday was nodding profusely when you were talking about infrastructure capital, Mahwa. And the language question, isn't it? The language gap there, I think it's a very telling one that probably you are also seeing, Alethea. But let me go to Francois first. So, Francois, what is the rail sector expecting from governments and from financial institutions to really get us to that shift that you were talking about? What could be needed?
Well, it's a tricky question, but I think what we have to keep in mind when we are speaking about finance, it's a very simple thing. There is no such thing as a free lunch. That means there will not be any magical financial formulas that will make but it proves the rentability of an investment in infrastructure where you have a distorted price signal. And basically what we have today, it's a distorted price signal because there are subsidies for fossil fuel energy. There is distortion everywhere. We all know what is a market, what is a competitive market, and by all means there is no competitive market for building infrastructure. So as the prices signal are distorted, there will be no natural financial mechanism that will allow to do that. What we have to do, and what is done in certain part of the world, is indeed to give an artificial price to the carbon. Why are we giving an artificial price to carbon? Because the actual price signal are distorted. So we need to have something that give a price that makes artificially those investments in rail or in public transport, something that has a financial interest. So we are still there, and I don't think that you will have some magic things purely on financial ground that will change this reality. Having said that, there are instruments, and I will insist on the instrument because what we have today, we have some instrument to, in a way, force some very carbon intensive industry like, I don't know, iron casting or energy production to reduce their carbon footprint, but this kind of instrument, they are sectoral. And for transport, I think that what we said repeatedly also during the last panel, we need to have a system view. We need to change the paradigm, and it was said we need to have active mobility, public transport, and rail as a part of the public transport, as a backbone of all of that. But changing that, that will be to have another idea, to say that modal shift per se, if we have the right evaluation feature, is an objective of the carbon reducing policy. So today, we have markets that, for instance, are made for compensation. You have industries that, I'm sorry to say that, I will be very curious to see what is a clean fuel for aviation. I'd like to see that because I'm not really convinced that it does exist, but perhaps it exists. But I do think that, and we heard that in the last panel, it will be very long to decarbonize aviation. So at some point, we need to invest in other sectors that are actually decarbonizing the economy. And I think that this kind of mechanism that we have to do, I think in UK you did that with the system of carbon economy certificate. You give an obligation, for instance, to the energy producer to finance action in the general public to isolate their house. And you collect the certificate, and then you have a financial mechanism. I do think that this kind of financial mechanism that not really are existing today for transport should be mobilized for active mobility. As it was said in the first panel, that's the first step. More active mobility will produce more attendance into public transport, let's say buses, metro, or whatever, three-wheelers, more people taking trains or taking rail, and then more infrastructure financing.
Okay.
But I think that's the kind of mechanism we have to set up, because I do think that by all means, there is no possible way that we change rapidly the price signals. We saw that in France with the Yellow Vest episode. We tried to change the price signals to do the actual price signal. Didn't really work very well because mainly our whole society is built on this price signal. So it will be long. So we need to invent those mechanisms that are at the end of the day financial mechanism, but with a very strong regulation.
Excellent. So basically that combination of financial measures, fiscal measures, pricing to help us progressively but quickly get out of the strong dependency that we have on fossil fuel subsidies in our sector, isn't it? Alicia, let me come to you now. We talked a lot about the challenges, isn't it? But we also know that the multilateral development banks are trying their best, isn't it? And are there to support countries who are really willing to move. So tell us a bit more about what CAF is doing on the supporting side, isn't it?
I think that many of the issues they have mentioned are really crucial for us. The question of language is really important. How to make possible that these innovative instruments you are mentioning can be understood by people who have to really implement these models. And this is mainly our role, to serve as an honest broker among those who can bring the technology and the financial instruments to those who really have to solve a problem of mobility and want to introduce electric mobility and they don't know how. So what we work mainly is in the strengthening the regulatory frameworks, increase the capabilities of those who have to deal with these investors and the private sector in general. And I even consider that our role is key in having a holistic approach to the mobility, because we are multilateral development banks, work in different sectors, infrastructures, cities, land use. There are many questions involved in mobility, urban design, we consider that we cannot discuss on mobility in an isolated manner. We need to have this holistic view, and this is the approach that we development banks have to really reinforce when talking with the countries. I would even say one question that has not been mentioned here and which is key for us, which is the gender element regarding mobility. Nowadays, all the projects we are introducing take into account the need to be inclusive, to take into account women mobility, and these kind of questions usually are not so much considered by financial instruments or private investors.
Absolutely.
Sometimes yes, but it's not always the case. So I think that by this holistic view, we can take the different pieces are needed to have a model that really works to the aim that increases the clean mobility in our cities and countries, but also improve people's quality of life. So this is our main challenge and where we are working right now.
Thanks very much. So holistic, social, economic, environment, climate benefits, and also all that at the service of the integrated multimodal systems that François was talking about. We're getting a bit short of time, and our honorable next guest has arrived. But nevertheless, Uday, you were talking already in your first intervention about how do we make sure that we enable those big pools of capital that exist. What are the principles, the key features that you think we should be putting in place in order for those capitals to flow effectively and on scale? Because it's all a matter of scale, as we were saying, isn't it?
So, is this working? No. Hello?
Yes.
That's working. Yeah, look, this can really be done. And of course it's sectoral, and we've heard the comments about the railways. But the exciting thing about road transport is that the TCOs are beginning to crush it. We are going to knock out diesel and petroleum. And as a result, it becomes a problem not of economics, but of financing. That's a very important point. And therefore, this model, if I can extract it out of what Mahua said earlier, and we're sort of on both sides of the same equation, is to create a shift from a CapEx to an OpEx model with a few key features. One is the sanctity of contracts, in the same way as happened in the power purchase agreements for renewable energy. Secondly, is a credit-worthy counterpart. And working on that, you know, the Indian government's doing a lot, and we can do a lot all over the planet. Thirdly, is making sure that there is an independent regulator that makes sure that these contracts are enforced, and a judicial recourse that's effective. And the last is an ecosystem of the operators, the manufacturers, the people who provide the electrons, the regulators, and the incentive providers, sitting with us as very long-term institutional investors and cracking in 1 year that which it would take capitalism on its own steam to crack over 10 years. And we can do that. But everyone needs to be convened. And therefore, I'm actually, and I know you're short of time, so I will curtail my comment, I actually believe we need an institution that's missing in the international environment. And I call it a global development and investment bank. And this would be an institution that convenes these processes, these trilateral processes, again and again and again, transport sector by transport sector, country by country. And then once it does that, 80% of your need for blended finance disappears. You then put in blended finance, and we've just launched the Global Blended Finance Alliance in Bali at the G20 2 days ago, and you wrap that, and finally you syndicate it to the institutional investors that we represent. That function is not being done by any institution on the planet today. If it gets set up and we do it quickly, we can really speed and scale this thing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Uday, because you've given us very specific points, a very clear menu, and with all the discussion that we know has also been occurring in COP, isn't it, about how the international financial system is working or not, and is contemporary or not. So thank you very much. Well, last but not least at all, I wanted to leave indeed our country last here, so we could learn a bit from the UK experience. Let me ask you something that connects very much with Alicia's point. There is a decarbonisation plan. Clearly, your commitments as a government are very clear in terms of the decarbonisation. But surely you're seeing other opportunities, isn't it, emerging from a holistic approach, as Alicia was saying. What are the particular ones that you can see emerging from for a country like the UK when you put in motion a decarbonisation plan for your transport sector?
There we go. So I say thank you very much. Fascinating comments about how we need to structure in terms of bringing in the pools of capital. I think what's interesting in transport, transport is always going to be a partnership with the public and the private sector. You talked about the language we need to develop. In the UK, transport is split £1 government, £9 private. So that gives you a sort of sense of already the scale, but we need to increase that. In terms of the broader benefits, you see, too often decarbonisation can be just pitted as a cost. And we've talked a lot about the money today, the 9-10 trillion pounds we need globally. But actually the benefits we're seeing in the UK as part of our transport decarbonisation plan go much beyond that. There's the obvious economic benefits. By being an early mover in decarbonisation, we see actually capturing the industrial benefits for the UK, the hydrogen centre up in Teessides, attracting inward investment, the work we're doing particularly around scaling up our R&D facilities, but also socially as well in terms of health benefits. We know petrol cars have big impacts on noise, on air quality. We're able through the shift to EVs to reduce NO2 levels and change the natural environment, and with a big shift to the livability of the urban centre, which I think actually is an increasing challenge for all countries in the 21st century.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Gareth. I am going to relinquish any time for conclusions because, Nigel, we got to really honour you, so let's keep it there. But give a hand to this amazing panel, please, because I think they've done a terrific job. Please. Thank you very much indeed to Gareth Davis, to Mahua Charwa, to Alicia Montalvo, to François Daven, and to Uday Kemka. I hope that we can continue the conversations, and I very much hope that next year at COP, I am no longer asking you about what can we do, but it's like what has happened that has actually put us in the right trajectory. Thank you so very much, and over to my colleague Christopher Decky from the SLOCAT Secretariat to have a wonderful chat with our UK champion Nigel Topping. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marusha. So, thanks everybody. As Marusha mentioned, my name is Christopher Decky. I'm the Director of Global Advocacy and Engagement at the SLOCAT Partnership Secretariat. And as we mentioned before, we're one of the co-focal points for the Transport Thematic Group in the Marrakesh Partnership. And it's really a great honor to be here with Nigel, who is the Cop26 high-level climate champion, and who has done an amazing job in trying to usher things forward in the Marrakesh Partnership. Nigel Topping was appointed at a very tumultuous time, I think, right? The pandemic was upon us, and we were really unsure what was going to happen with the work of the Marrakesh Partnership. Then in came Nigel, and he really did help build a lot of the efforts, building this high-level champions team, trying to really ensure that while the pandemic was going on, we still had progress taking place. And now here we are at Cop27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, and progress does continue. So I just wanted to ask you a couple of quick questions in this fireside chat. So our speakers talked primarily about just transition and finance, and I want you to reflect a bit on how these two elements, so just transition finance, will help play a role in putting transport on a credible pathway to decarbonize by 2050.
Well, first of all, it's really great to be here. I want to thank SLOCAT and ITF and all the Marrakesh partners for all the work over the years. I think it's really good that you start with a question about just transition, because I think we can be really proud of the momentum we see on the technological transition in road transport in particular, but also we're starting to see it now in shipping and aviation. But one of the things I've been most pleased at in this COP is we are starting to elevate the issues of resilience, and that includes the just transition. Like in shipping, for example, we were at an event with Lloyd's Register yesterday about safety in shipping. There's 40 million people going to be working in the shipping sector by 2030. A lot of them from poor countries, one of the most dangerous professions in the world, and with a huge technological transition going on. And then in terms of the if you like, particularly the urban road transport. I mean, I just feel we've got to find a way to get the clarity of midterm goal on the avoid and shift. But, you know, we kind of know what they mean, but it's very hard to, like, when you can pin a target of 15% sustainable aviation fuel, or 200 clean ships, or 60% EV market share. We get a clear North Star and we can converge around that. So I think hopefully with the Lotus initiative, which the presidency can join, which I understand is still an invitation to co-create, right? It's not fully formed. And with the Egyptian presidency launching the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda, I think we as a community have an opportunity to get more specific about some of the common metrics that can help us drive, avoid and shift behavior across all sectors, but particularly in urban mobility, which I think is the greatest need.
Thank you very much, Nigel. And yeah, I mean, you're really touching on some of the key issues here. And certainly we'll see how the Lotus initiative that's being launched tomorrow, like you said, that we've been working on with the Egyptian presidency, can see how that can maybe move the needle even further. But now that you're kind of moving on from the high-level champions team and reflecting on a lot of the achievements that you've had in your position, can you talk a bit about those achievements? I mean, certainly you've really helped the MPGCA grow. The Transport Thematic Group has grown. You've brought in so many new entities through Race to Zero, Race to Resilience. Can you just reflect a bit on some of those achievements?
Yeah, I mean, I think between us all, we have managed to assemble like a massive coalition globally of countries, companies, banks, over 1,000 cities, many states and regions, universities, you know, who are all very clear that we've got to get to net zero in the 2040s, and who are increasingly confident that we know how to do it. And I think of the pioneering work which the Marrakesh partners did, encouraged by Gonzalo with that crazy request to publish 1.5 degree pathways. You know, this is catalytic, right? When you get a lot of people saying we can do it, and then you get a technical document saying how to do it. And it's great to see Jane here from ICAO, because we've had lots of conversations over the last few years. And I think, you know, the ICAO decision recently is absolutely historic, and, you know, really kudos to you. But we know, don't we, that all those surround sound signals of businesses and of buyers and of countries saying it. So that's one thing. I think we're starting to create a much cleverer way of building momentum for systems change by not just focusing on one actor. It's much easier for everybody to act when they see momentum everywhere else. I'm particularly proud this week that we've managed to elevate resilience, I think, much closer to being on a par. It's been a poor relation forever, and we've now got to work together to mobilize this Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda. But that's the first time a presidency has named at a COP a collaboration with the Marrakesh Partnership. And I would say we've kind of scrambled to get it over the line, and I think there's some fine-tuning to be done on some of the targets, but the spirit of collaboration and that ambition loop is there. I'm really pleased with the work on mobilizing finance. I mean, GFANS is going from strength to strength, and that's starting to bite. And then with Mahmoud's help, we've had much more of a focus on the real challenge of how do we mobilize finance in emerging markets. And the paper which the presidencies and the champions commissioned on finance for climate action, which Nick Stern and Vera Songwei wrote, is, I think, a really good kind of much broader blueprint than just the future of the 100 billion goal. And then finally, you know, we submitted a plan to the parties in Glasgow which said we'd do all these things, but in particular it promised that we would regionalise the work, because like so much of this work there has been a global north bias, and so we particularly focus on Africa. We've created an amazing small team led by Bakolo Kenawendo, former Minister of Trade and Investment in Botswana, but, you know, distributed South Africa, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, Kenya, Botswana, Egypt, Morocco. And that team has then worked with, if you like, the kind of African Marrakesh Partnership, so a whole group of non-state actors in Africa, to, in very quick order, launch African Green Hydrogen Alliance, African Carbon Markets Initiative, African Climate Insurance, Climate Risk Facility, African Net Zero Concrete. So I think that's really important, that often, you know, grand global initiatives often are biased by the bias of economies and industry in the global north, and therefore don't really play to this particular needs and dynamics. So the African Carbon Markets Initiative, Baholo pulled that together in about 4 or 5 months from when we had a round table on mobilizing finance in Africa in the summer, and we had 4 presidents turn up, past and present, to launch it. And it was very much an African initiative grounded in Africa with some south-to-south support. Former President Duarte is on the steering group of that. So yeah, I'm really proud that we're starting. I think next year the opportunity is to continue that kind of growing of regional momentum in Asia with an Emirati presidency obviously representing Asia.
No, that's great to hear, and certainly this is part of really what the mandate and role of the MPGCA is meant to do. It's meant to bring all these different parties, stakeholders together, and that's really critical. And it's great to see that expansion, I think, in the Global South, working more closely in the African region. And I know you brought up Mahmoud, and of course Mahmoud now has the senior role in the Champions duology. So what really comes next in the transport space for the high-level Champions team? I mean, I'm sure there are some plans going forward, but what do you think is going to come next? What role will Mahmoud play, you think, in preparing for the next high-level champion? And what can we look out for from the transport thematic group?
Well, I think in terms of the technology breakthroughs for shipping, aviation, and road transport, we kind of know what we need to do, and we need to just get on with it. And we're sort of already on those exponential curves. So I think and what Mahmoud will bring in spades, has brought in spades, is this real focus on mobilizing finance in emerging markets. And we've had these regional roundtables, and I'd encourage the Marrakesh partners to help bring projects that haven't yet been financed into that process, which is co-run by the UN Economic Commissions in the 5 regions. I think I know who the Emirati champion is going to be. She's going to be great, but it hasn't been announced yet. Hopefully that'll be announced soon. Some of you know I've been advocating. I had hoped that Mahmoud would be female, but he's been great. But we had 2 female champions, and then I think I'm the 4th, and then Mahmoud the 5th. So we have to address that. So that's great news. But I think that obviously there'll be a focus on Asia. I think we've got some intellectual work to do together on the kind of just transition. As I say, the avoid and shift, which are more the human element of the transport transition than the technological element. We don't need to slow down on the technological, but we do need to make sure that in this age of rapid urbanization, and that's kind of one of my thoughts is maybe we need to make that more of a nexus issue with the great cities networks that we've got and the transport partners, because it feels like it's the cities who are going to implement a lot of the policies and infrastructure that will determine whether we encourage active mobility, whether we have great public transport, or whether we're just building for zero carbon cars. And I am encouraged by some of the stuff I see in India with this massive injection of ambition for like $10 billion into 50,000 electric buses, and some of the work that's been going on in Latin America to electrify buses so that we have high quality, zero carbon public transport systems. But yeah, I think for me that's going to be intellectually the place we have to collectively lean in next year.
Yeah, no, that's really great to hear, and of course, the shift towards the human elements of transport and mobility is critical for SLOCAT and for many of our partners, and really happy to hear that the next champion will be a woman. So this is certainly great to hear, and the UAE hopefully will announce something soon. That'll be exciting news. But Nigel, I know you don't have too much time, but I want to give you the last couple of minutes to maybe give any final closing remarks, any final words before we go on our way.
Well, I would just end by thanking everybody here. We have this fancy title of high-level champion. Really just means championing the great work of an amazing community, and it's impossible to keep up with everything. Seriously, 5 years ago, I felt like I knew everything that was going on in the world of climate change. Now I'm just completely overwhelmed. I can't keep up, which is great, right? It'd be really sad if we could still keep up. So really, huge thanks. Also, just to say, I am very excited about the momentum and the dynamism and the agility which you bring to a process which sometimes is quite stodgy and moves very slowly. And what I have realized in the 3 years I've been in the role is that the parties recognize that. That's why they created the role. That's why they, I mean, I've just come from a couple more bilaterals. We have bilaterals with all the negotiating groups. They're really grateful and excited about the momentum you're doing. The one thing I'd say is, please, let's back ourselves as ingenious, collaborative, determined human beings to deliver a transformation that is just, resilient, and stays within 1.5 degrees. Don't allow the naysayers, the grumpy, the gloomy people to say, oh my God, we're doing so badly. We have momentum that's growing every year. We're going faster and faster and faster. And we need to tell people about all the success stories that you are aware of. You know, we need to tell the press, that we need to give them counter-examples every time they say nothing's happening, it's really terrible. Because the press love a gloomy story. I remember I gave it one of the shocking insights I had. I was doing a background briefing to a major media organization about a year ago. And it was an environment editor who was saying they really wanted to cover the positives of the process. And because I was saying, look, you need to know there's loads of great stuff happening. And then they actually said to me, but you know, Nigel, in our industry we have a saying, if it bleeds, it leads. So I think we need to get much smarter about doing press briefings, sharing great stories. And you guys have them. I think, you know, the Champions team can maybe work with you to help coordinate them. You know, an hour with 10 journalists, bring in 3 non-state actors with great stories of, you know, active mobility in a city, of accelerated decarbonisation in a region, of a company that's doing something, and feed the press with good stories, because I have a feeling that they don't really go looking for them. So we need to bring the good stories to them. But I'll just end by saying thank you for the faith placed in me. I've learned enormously. I mean, you know, when I started this job, I wouldn't have talked about avoid and shift. I was just EV. I've learned enormously. I continue to learn. I think that's what we all have to do. None of us can do this on our own. We have to continually be determined, confident, and yet humble that if we come together and radically collaborate to learn, then we can and will deliver solutions.
Thank you, Nigel, and really don't be a stranger. I mean, the thematic group is always open to everyone to join us and to work with us, and certainly the progress that's been made will continue, and hopefully we'll be able to do this again next year and see where we've come from in the past couple of years and see where we end up, because certainly time is running out, as we all know, and this bit that you mentioned about the press, well, certainly we all have to work a bit on how we communicate to the outside world, because all of us, I think, suffer a bit from that. But that's definitely a challenge that we should take up. But I want to thank you now, Nigel, for your time and for your dedication and your service to this work. And I want to thank all of you for joining us. I want to thank ITF. I want to thank ITF as our co-focal point and for the hard work we've been doing together over the past couple of years. And of course, it's very much, I want to thank the high-level champions team and especially the few of you who are here constantly working with us, like Angie and Higazi, and Ahmed. It's been really a pleasure, and of course I look forward to continuing this collaboration. So thank you, everybody, and I hope you enjoy the rest of Cop27.
Thank you.
And I think we have time for a quick photo for all the speakers. I know some may have already left, but if whoever's left, please come to the stage and we'll take a photo.
talk about nature-based solutions because there is still nature. We have a wonderful panel to start off, and we're going to talk about policy. And so joining us this afternoon, we have Milagros Sandoval Diaz, who is the Director General of Climate Change and Desertification in the Ministry of Environment in Peru. Next to Milagros, we have Kevin Macedo, who's the Sustainability Director for Natura & Co. We have Jorge Mario Rodriguez from Fonefifo in Costa Rica. And Jorge Mario will be speaking in Spanish, and he has a wonderful translator next to him who will translate after he speaks. As you know, for anybody speaking in French or Arabic or who wants translation in those languages, it is available not with these, but with the other headsets that you can get at the back of the room. And finally, last but not least, we have Jean Nell from Wageningen University and Research. And I'm going to ask everybody to start to give us just 1 minute of what your vision is and what you're doing to make sure that policy becomes an enabling environment to make nature-based solutions work. Milagros, let me start with you.
Thank you, Valerie, and thank you for the invitation. I think mainly because of my job title, I'm in charge of the Peru NDC. So specifically on your question, I think what we're doing directly in Peru is that definitely NDCs in Peru are very much related to nature and to nature-based solutions, and definitely we are working specifically right now in updating our national climate change strategy, which will reflect the NDCs and the measures we're working on, but that obviously has a link to biodiversity. And that's, I think, one of the most important issues, how from policy you then go to practice, but also how from practice you can have input to take to policy. So I think that's something that we are right now working on, that flow of information that comes and goes, and definitely I think that is one of the biggest challenges we now have, but it's also a great opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Milagros. That idea of going from policy to practice and back again is so important. Kevin, what does that mean for a company and not a government?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for the invitation. I think that we are very glad to attend this Biodiversity Day. And I think that it's very clear the mindset that we have created more than 20 years ago. The standing forest should deliver greater value than deforestation. So in practical terms, we transform social and environmental challenges in a business opportunity, transforming, of course, all the issues that we have been facing, especially in the Amazon rainforest in Brazil, to try to deliver prosperity for local population, as well as trying to enhance a little bit of a traditional knowledge of those local populations, introducing the Brazilian biodiversity not only to the Brazilian citizenship, but also around the globe with our brands called Echoes.
Kevin, this idea of going beyond bee and going beyond biomass, and it can have value when it's standing, I think is so important and such an important aspect of thinking about policy changes. Jorge Mario, please.
Sí, muchas gracias. Muy buenas tardes a todas y todos. Muchas gracias, Hillary, compañeros de la mesa. Bueno, en Costa Rica, soy Jorge Mario Rodríguez, director del Fondo Nacional de Financiamiento Forestal, que es la institución encargada del programa de pago por servicios ambientales adscrita al Ministerio de Ambiente y Energía.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. We have here the director of the National Fund for Forestry Funding.
Okay. Bueno, Costa Rica desde hace mucho tiempo comprendió que no podemos aspirar a un desarrollo sostenible si no es cuidando la naturaleza, protegiendo la biodiversidad y trabajando, como hemos hecho durante varias décadas, con soluciones basadas en la naturaleza.
They have realized that it's not possible to achieve sustainable development if we're not working with nature, with the resources, protecting them, and that's what they're doing now.
Esperamos compartir un poco las experiencias que hemos tenido, que nos han dado resultados y por lo tanto aspiramos a ese desarrollo verde que Costa Rica trabaja para ello.
So he's going to be sharing Costa Rica's experiences and the results that they've achieved with their nature-based solution strategies in the country.
Thank you, Jorge Mario, and I'll be very interested to hear more, as will our audience, because Costa Rica is always held up as such a great example of turning good policy into great practice and better results, and so it'll be very interesting to hear. But Jean, what about you?
Well, from a research and university side, what I would like to do is to encourage academics to become really actively engaged in actions and solutions for nature-based futures, to work not only at a needs-based fit-for-purpose level with our technologies, but also to work with industry and governments to make sure that the good intentions that we have with our proposed solutions don't have unintended consequences of harming nature or harming vulnerable groups of people. And when you start to work with communities, what happens is you start to learn and you start to move together. And I think this is desperately needed. When you start to learn like this, you start to respect people, understand differences, and develop a love and care for people and nature, which I think should be going front and center with the facts and figures and evidence that science generates.
Thank you, Jean. I think that idea of integrating modern science and technology with traditional knowledge and traditional practice and having all the voices at the table becomes so important. Milagros, one of the things Jean mentioned was that good ideas are not good enough. Peru has some excellent policies, not always implemented as well as perhaps imagined. So what are the barriers going forward to doing a robust implementation of those policies?
Thank you very much for the question, and I think it is, I want to bring in an echo what Jean has mentioned. Definitely having a very biodiverse country is an absolutely opportunity, but it's also a challenge. And because, why? Because we're not only biodiverse in ecosystemic way, we're also diverse in a cultural way. And I think many of us right now in this table have these same challenges. But let me just give you a quick example of the differences and how we're learning by doing. We have different indigenous peoples in Peru, as well as in many other countries. And many of us have been working with them throughout the years. And I want to put an example specifically of the Awajún women in the northeast of Peru. In the northeast, these women have unfortunately been, their lands have been deforested, but they really want to bring back their traditional knowledge. And their traditional knowledge is linked to the forest, to nature. And what they are trying to bring back is specifically their staple crop, that is cassava. And with cassava, we have learned that also through them that there are 400 varieties of cassava. Information that is not necessarily reflected in documents, in publications, that is really right now in traditional knowledge, and we need to reflect it in order to do better policies and implement or manage or work on better policies for this purpose. So definitely, many of our Latin American countries have wonderful policies, but at the moment we implement, there's always a challenge because being so biodiverse, being diverse also culturally, implies that we have to do some learning by doing possibilities in order to see if the policies we've made reflect on or really can be implemented at the subnational or local levels. One of the ways we're addressing this challenge is specifically by, we have created as part of the climate change governance, and that also is related to biodiversity, indigenous peoples platform that reflects on the platform that we have here at the UNFCCC. So that definitely is important because we have the voice, we can hear the voices of the 7 different indigenous organizations at the national level, and through them we can also support participatory process to reflect how we can manage and make better these policies and that can be really implemented effectively at the subnational and local levels. Thank you.
Thank you, Milagros, and thank you too for representing the voices of those women, because I think it's one of the biggest challenges we have at meetings like this is the reality that where we have some of the richest biodiversity, we have some of the poorest people, and yet we depend on them to steward that biodiversity. And so representing their voices here and speaking about how important it is not just to have them at the table, but to bring their knowledge. They know their lands, they know their biodiversity. And this is something, Jorge Mario, that Costa Rica has done very well through its Payment for Environmental Services scheme, is it's tried to make sure that those people who are managing the forests and managing the watersheds are rewarded for doing it. How did you make that happen?
Sí, muchas gracias. Tal vez antes de contestar puntualmente la pregunta, recordar que Costa Rica durante la década de los 80 fue un campeón en la deforestación. Creíamos que podíamos desarrollarnos económicamente a costa de la corta de los bosques.
Before answering the question, he would like to say and remind everyone that Costa Rica was a champion on deforestation during the 80s.
Sí, entendimos que para proteger esas masas boscosas existentes o recuperar áreas de vocación forestal no era posible solamente con los esfuerzos gubernamentales, sin la participación de las personas que viven ahí, en este caso las comunidades locales, los territorios indígenas y el sector privado.
However, they then understood that they had to protect this biodiversity and this forest, and it was not going to be possible only through the government and by the government, but they had to bring together all of stakeholders, including local communities, indigenous peoples, and the private sector.
Un paso muy importante para eso fue hacer ver no solamente a la comunidad nacional, sino insistir en la comunidad internacional que los bosques valen más por los servicios ambientales que por la madera que contienen, sin menospreciar el ingreso que puedan tener los dueños de los bosques por el manejo sostenible de estas áreas, de estos ecosistemas.
So for this it was important as a step to think about the forest not only as having value as wood, but also through their environmental services and how sometimes this would actually provide better and more benefits. However, also acknowledging the importance of local communities' forest management.
Empezamos creando una ley forestal en 1996, donde se reconoce el pago de servicios ambientales que brindan los bosques y las plantaciones forestales, y la ley define 4 servicios ambientales que son protección de la biodiversidad, protección del recurso hídrico, belleza escénica y mitigación de gases de efecto invernadero.
¿Repito el cuarto?
Mitigación de gases de efecto invernadero.
So in 1996, Costa Rica passed the forestry law, which included environmental services payments and also payment for forestry plantations. And it had these main points or strategies, which was the protection of biodiversity, protection of water, and the mitigation of greenhouse gases.
Iniciamos en esta ley creando un impuesto al consumo de combustibles fósiles y una porción de ese impuesto el Ministerio de Hacienda lo gira al FONAFIFO, donde trabajo, para nosotros hacerle una transferencia a los dueños de bosque por esos servicios ambientales.
So the way to get resources and funds to implement this law was to create this task to the consumption of fossil fuels And this tax was given to FONAFIFO to make these payments to local communities that were protecting the biodiversity for its ecosystem services.
Convencidos de la necesidad de proteger los bosques, Costa Rica, adicional a este impuesto al consumo de combustibles fósiles, suscribió con el Banco Mundial 2 empréstitos por $61 millones y esos empréstitos eran precisamente para pagar servicios ambientales a los pequeños y medianos productores que protegían el bosque o que sembraban árboles.
Additionally, because they felt this need to protect the forest, they have 2 loans from the World Bank that add up to $61 million. And this was to provide funding to small and medium stakeholders that were being paid for maintaining ecosystem services.
Una característica de estos empréstitos es que recibíamos como país una donación de $10 millones del GEF. Entonces, orientamos esos recursos a pagar $10 por hectárea a todos aquellos campesinos, productores que ingresaran al pago de servicios ambientales como algo adicional. Creo que eso despertó mucho el interés y hemos venido evolucionando constantemente este programa.
Something important that came as well with these loans was the donation from GEF of $10 million, and this allowed them as well to make a payment of $10 per hectare to smallholders that were protecting environmental services, and that has created or enhanced a lot of attention, and they keep working and developing this strategy and program.
Ahora, en esta COP, nuestro señor ministro, don Franz Stackenbach, expuso ese paso adelante que como país vamos a dar para ya no solamente ver el paisaje como forestal, sino verlo como un agropaisaje que involucra agricultura e involucra ganadería, y estamos levantando una serie de programas e iniciativas que van a favorecer a los campesinos que hagan las cosas mejor y que puedan representar un impacto positivo, no solamente en la protección de la biodiversidad, sino aumentar parte de los corredores biológicos que conectan las áreas silvestres protegidas.
Also, he wants to highlight that in this COP, the environmental ministry is here, and he had this message that they're thinking about a strategy that goes from a forestry landscape to an agroforestry landscape, in which they expect positive impact on the protection of biodiversity and also in enhancing biological corridors that would join together the natural protected areas in Costa Rica.
Y por último, tal vez en esta intervención, insistir en que cualquier iniciativa que desarrollemos no va a ser exitosa si no es involucrando al sector privado, a las comunidades locales, a los territorios indígenas y a toda la sociedad civil para conjuntamente construir estas soluciones basadas en la naturaleza.
And to add to this, we know that this initiative won't work, these programs won't work if we do not bring together all stakeholders, indigenous peoples, the private sector, local communities, to implement these nature-based solutions.
And it all started with a very robust forestry law. And from that cascaded down all of that important implementation and finance that made it work. Keivan, how important are robust public policies for the private sector? Does it make a difference? Do you look to the public sector for good policy, or is it irrelevant?
Yeah, good question. And I think that in the end, of course, regulation always support, of course, to try to standardize the process, the environmental context, and equalize a little bit what is the minimum requirements that we demand from the private sector. But in the other hand, it's very true that the leading companies normally are a little bit advanced on those regulations. So let me offer these concrete examples about once we are about to start the CBD Cop15 in a few weeks, and today is the Biodiversity Day, about access and benefit sharing. So Brazil has a pre-law on access and benefit sharing, that was issued by 2004. But I think that in the case of Natura, 30 years ago, by the Rio Conventions in '92, we decided that we need to do something to tackle not only climate change, but also to tackle a little bit about biodiversity. It was the beginning of a journey that 8 years later, we launched the brand that I call Ecos. And I think that in 2000, when we launched the brand, we decided, okay, how we are going to start making the access and benefit sharing with those communities that we made the access of those raw ingredients. And it was too complicated because by the end, we did not have any reference. So we adopt what we consider to be fair. And after the legislation in 2004, we need to adapt a little bit what are the things that we are doing with those local communities. And I think that finally in 2015, Brazil issued a final law on access and benefit sharing. And due to the previous experience that we faced with almost more than one decade, we were allowed, of course, to contribute a little bit to adapt not only the legislation, but also all the systems, because when we're talking about payment on access and benefit sharing, you need to have a system, of course, that allowed you to have the right payments and send these to the right people that deserve to receive those benefits, and of course, use those benefits to preserve and to restore the biodiversity in their communities.
So public policy isn't necessarily important for the good actors and the first movers, but if it catches up with them, it makes the playing field more level. It's a very interesting concept. Now, Jean, one of the things we always hear when it comes to public policy and making that playing field level is the importance of research. But too often research moves at its own pace, which is often a snail's pace. In a world where we need urgent action and where private companies or even public actors have a small window of opportunity to make a change, is research fit for purpose in this space?
Actually, that's exactly the point that I wanted to make. I was saying, you asked what the challenges were, and I was going to actually say that the slow pace of science sometimes in catching up is of a concern, and we need to speed that up. But and there again, I go back and I would like to support what the panel has been said already, is that we need this action research. We need to just do it, get out there, not wait for the perfect policy or the perfect solution, but be open-minded enough and flexible enough to actually navigate as we need. And so I think that's really a very important thing, and I really draw inspiration from initiatives like our agroecological experimental farm in the Netherlands, where it started out as just a seed idea of getting a few farmers to play with putting more diversity into their field with strip cropping, which they can even do in 6-meter strips with the same machinery that they usually use. And just by doing that and playing with these experiments, these farmers, it's spread to 150 farms, and the farmers are starting to get more radical in their practices and even more diverse in their practices because their values are changing and they're really seeing the benefits that are not really affecting their yields at all. So just do it, get out there, and as you do that, people can see and touch and see the successes.
I think it's a message for all of us, is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and just do it. And it speaks a little bit to what Milagros was talking about earlier, this idea of research by doing, policy by doing. Let's practice it, let's build it let's do it as we build it. But Keivan, I know you have to leave us in just a couple of minutes, so I just wanted to get your final thoughts, including on how does the private sector contribute to the research agenda that goes back into the policy arena?
Very good point. And let me use the example about what we consider on the Amazon program that we established in 2010, which delivered great results so far. And basically we covered 3 points. One of the points is that how we can have strained relations, especially when we are talking about the Amazon regions, which means how we can connect with other private companies together with the public sector, together with the NGOs and civil society to have a better infrastructure for the region. Second, how we can create sustainable value chains. And finally, to address your point, how we can create a network of researchers. Some of them could be based locally, some could be based outside the regions, and share knowledge about the developments that they are achieving, so we can exchange a little bit and not, of course, use for our self-consumption.
No, thank you so much. That idea of bridging the public and the private sector, and the private and the academic sector and the research community is so important. Milagros, how do you make those bridges across government? At the panel today we have ministries of environment, which of course are an important ministry, but are not the only ministry that's important when it comes to integrating development, climate and nature. So how do you work across government to make sure policies are aligned?
Thank you. I think that also it's not only a challenge for Latin America, but in overall for many countries. I'm seeing interesting structural changes in governments right now, and I think that's something that we will need to assess when the time comes, probably soon in Latin America. But maybe I think that I would like to highlight, especially related to the NDC, that, as I mentioned, has a lot of measures related to nature-based solutions. The way in which we currently work, and is part of the governance that our climate change law established, is that we have three main governance structures. One I mentioned before, that is our Indigenous Peoples Platform. The other one is our National Climate Change Commission, which has around 22 years of creation. So this is a very old and very interesting process that we have gone through. And the other one is the recently created High-Level Commission on Climate Change. And this commission is the establishment through which we approved our new measures related to the NDC, many of them, as I mentioned, related to nature. And here we discuss through 14 ministries at the highest level, so it's the minister or deputy ministers that are engaged in this process. Also a representative from subnational governments, as well as representative from local governments, because we're speaking about all of these measures have to be implemented in a specific territory. So there needs to be engagement of these other institutions and these other stakeholders that are more near the implementation. So this is part of a structural process that's been going on since now 2 years that we're implementing this climate change law. But definitely there are, we still need to strengthen capacities there. We need to follow things. But as I mentioned, and was mentioned before also by Jan, we are learning by doing. But I think that cannot stop us from taking decisions, from moving, linking these processes as well, and not only linking it at the government level, but also with very important stakeholders, and especially relating to the private sector, which is definitely one of the constituencies that we want to link again, and that is very important in order to reach especially our NDC. Thank you very much.
So Jorge, Mario, I'm going to take what Milagros said about the importance of working across institutions and having those difficult conversations. You have a difficult conversation ahead of you. The Payment for Environmental Services scheme in Costa Rica, as you told us, is paid for by a fossil fuel tax at the pump. So what happens when Costa Rica only has electric vehicles and nobody's paying at the pump anymore? What sort of conversations are you already having with the Ministry of Energy and the Ministry of Transport to make sure that as you go electric, you don't lose the ability to pay for your PES scheme?
Sí, gracias. Bueno, tenemos claro en Costa Rica que al ser la principal fuente de financiamiento del pago de servicio ambiental, el impuesto a los combustibles, en el mediano plazo, por la transición energética, pues vamos a ver disminuidos esos ingresos.
It is clear for the government of Costa Rica that for the energy transition that's going to happen, the main source of resources for the payment for ecosystem services will be lower, but they have thought about it and they have a strategy.
Es precisamente por eso que venimos desarrollando una serie de iniciativas en los cuales estamos identificando fuentes alternas de financiamiento a nivel nacional e internacional que creemos nos van a dar los recursos financieros necesarios no solamente para proteger lo que hemos construido, sino para ampliar el pago de servicios ambientales a otros ecosistemas.
So this strategy that they're developing is to have an initiative, they have an initiative to reach out to new funding sources within Costa Rica and also outside of the country internationally, not just to maintain and sustain what they've been doing, but also increase the program, make it larger, bigger, and better.
Por ejemplo, la oferta agroexportable de Costa Rica, nosotros podemos decir que es un producto que llega al mercado de un país con cero deforestación y neto en emisiones. Si bien es cierto, agricultura y ganadería producen emisiones, lo cierto también es que todo lo que hacemos en el sector forestal compensa las emisiones de esos sectores.
For example, they acknowledge that their exports on agricultural goods from Costa Rica mean a zero deforestation acknowledgement and as well net zero greenhouse gas emissions, which they achieve by protecting their forests.
Entonces creemos, ya para terminar la pregunta, creemos que la comunidad internacional podría eventualmente, con una disminución en los aranceles para la importación de productos de Costa Rica y que esa disminución de aranceles sean el alimento para un fondo de financiamiento que permita ampliar esas actividades o consolidar las que ya tenemos. Gracias.
So to finish, they believe and they hope that the international community will lower the import tax on Costa Rican products so that this money that the government will save can actually be put towards this program for ecosystem services payments and not only maintain it but make it better through this lowering of the import tax. Thank you.
It just speaks to the very complex but very important conversations that are going to have to happen not just in the national policy arena, but internationally. Jean, I want to finish with you. We've talked a lot about policy. You come from the research world. What do you see as the most important innovation on the horizon right now that's going to help us combat the climate and biodiversity crisis?
Nature. The most important innovation, yeah, you know, I think that we really need to think about putting back some of the values and emotions into our evidence, actually, that we need to be connecting with people. So for me, the innovation itself, the content of what you're doing is important, but equally important is really how you engage with people, how you relate to people, how you relate to nature. And I think for me, the more that universities can convene these spaces with communities, policymakers, decision makers, as a place where you can come as a third space with no maybe private interest or public policy, but to create these spaces where you can surface these difficult conversations and come away with less polarization and more social consciousness to move forward, I think the better. So for me, it's not necessarily the innovation, but it's how you do the innovation.
I love the idea that the nature deficit disorder that's impacting our economies today is making life much worse for too many people. It's also making our public policy discussions and our research discussions too bland, and that we need to put our emotion back into our evidence. Please join me in thanking this fantastic panel. Thank you so much, everybody. And while I ask my next panel to come and join me, here's the 4 things I heard from this panel. Please, if you don't mind, we're going to do this on the fly. So the first thing I heard, and this Milagro started it, but I think everybody else confirmed it, is that we have to go from policy to practice and back again. That we have to learn by doing. We can't wait for the perfect. We have to go with the good enough. We heard so much about the need to build bridges, whether it's between the public sector and the private sector, across ministries in the public sector, and with the academic and research communities. We heard about how important institutions are, and we heard about how important finance is, and that's what we're going to speak about in this next panel, the importance of money and the importance of those institutions that have to spend that money to combat the climate and biodiversity crisis. I'm joined by a fantastic panel. To my right, I have Zoe Knight, who's the Group Head of Sustainable Finance at HSBC. Then we have Jason Spenceley, Senior Climate Change Specialist at the Global Environmental Facility. Christian Sampers next to him, who's the Managing Director and Leader for Nature Solutions at the Bezos Earth Fund. And then we have Dr. Walid Waslati, who's the Head of Environment Transitions and Resilience in the Environmental Directorate at OECD. And then finally, last but not least, Dr. Alhamdou Dorsouma, who's the Director of Climate Change and Green Growth at the Africa Development Bank. So let me start, Zoe, with you, and we'll just go down the line 1 minute on why finance matters and what are the big questions in this arena.
So thank you for the opportunity to join you this afternoon. 1 minute on why nature matters and why biodiversity matters. Okay, so the world is dependent on water for activities, for our power systems where we're using hydro, for obviously goods and services in the agricultural sector, but more importantly, that supply chain impact affects all of us through the goods and services that we buy. So therefore, if there is no assessment of the risks embedded in biodiversity or nature in terms of nature disruption, then we're heading for an economic disaster without looking at them effectively.
Natural capital is economic capital. It's about opportunities, but it's about risk. Jason, what view from the vertical funds?
Well, okay. The science is clear. The drivers of the shared crisis of biodiversity and climate are intrinsically intertwined, and the solutions need to be intertwined. Nature-based solutions, ecosystem-based solutions. Therefore, finance needs to follow this science. Policy needs to follow science, and finance needs to follow science. We need to find ways of financing multiple wins for biodiversity and for the climate.
Again, going back to that, such an important point that we heard earlier today and all throughout the day today, the importance of integration, development, climate, and nature together as one. Christian, why would Bezos put any of his money into biodiversity and into this crisis?
Thanks, Valerie. Because we all live in this one planet, we share it, and we rely on it for everything. Without the nature, there will be no development, there will be no business, there will be no goods. And by the way, we do share it with 10 million other species, so there's an ethical and moral responsibility as well. Unfortunately, Jeff Bezos agreed on this and saw it and made a pledge 2 years ago to invest $10 billion, which is tiny compared to the needs that we have. So the question is, what is the different role that philanthropy can play, and how does it leverage other funds? And I suspect we're coming back to that in your next round of questions.
For sure, that's right where I want to go after we've all made our introductory statements. But Walid, tell us a little bit about why OECD cares about this space.
Yes, so why do OECD care? Our member countries are playing an important role in the global economy, and also, as you know, we host the Development Assistance Committee, and we were tracking all the public finance for development assistance. And the recent data we have show in the area of biodiversity are mainly driven by climate change. I have the number here, 78% of biodiversity related official development finance being related to climate change. And OECD data also shows that the opposite does not hold, with only 21% of climate-related development finance also targeting biodiversity. I would say here that climate change and biodiversity are the two sides of the same coin. So we are dealing with what we call common goods, global common goods, and needs policies, but it's not only the responsibility of public decision makers, but also it's our responsibility, all of us. So public finance, sure, that's something have to play an important role and have to be mobilized for mainly vulnerable and developing economies, but private sector, private investment have to play an important role. So it's important to unlock capital to invest in biodiversity, and I join all the panelists about different solutions like nature-based solutions which play an important role in addition to the major project and development that we have. Thanks.
The idea again that natural capital is economic capital, which means there's a lot of different finance that has to support it. Alhamdi, what's the role of multilateral development banks? Why does this matter to Africa?
Thank you very much. I think the biodiversity agenda is becoming very critical for us as the multilateral development banks, not only because it's a topical issue. We saw what happened last year in Glasgow when there was a declaration, leaders' declaration on halting and reversing biodiversity loss by 2030. But also as MDBs, we adopted a joint statement last year in Glasgow to also mainstream biodiversity into our development interventions in all our geographies. And as far as Africa is concerned, as you know, biodiversity is a very important asset for the continent. As we all know, African countries rely on biodiversity for their livelihoods, for fighting poverty, and also for providing food security for the population. And based on that, and given that we are, for instance, the African Development Bank, the first development financier in the continent, this biodiversity has become an important issue for us to help African countries support the development agenda in sustainably using their biodiversity, their natural capital, knowing that 70% of sub-Saharan African countries, for instance, rely on forest and land for their livelihoods, and yet those resources are being used and harnessed unsustainably, and some of those resources are being actually exploited in an illegal way. So there is a real need here to ensure that we mainstream biodiversity in our operation first, help our client countries also have right in place the regulations and policies that can enable them to protect their biodiversity. And on financing, lastly, I think there are opportunities. We can use development finance to mainstream biodiversity into existing development operations, but also harness the potential of innovative tools that are existing in order to maximize the protection of biodiversity. We can use, for instance, sustainable bonds proceeds to support biodiversity activities, but I hope we'll have time to go through those innovative tools later. Thank you.
And now that's exactly where I want to go, into how do we begin to link? Because you'll see at this table, we have development finance represented, we have private finance, we have traditional grant finance, we have new philanthropic finance. Traditionally in the environment space, it was all philanthropy, it was all grants, it was all project finance. We talked about financing green projects. We didn't talk about financing green economies. That has shifted. So Christian, I want to put the question to you because it's the one you raised. We have different types of finance at the table, and sadly, we don't tend to collaborate well. We're still very fragmented in the field. What are you going to do to make sure that the Bezos capital, which is important grant capital, is going to help defragment the financial architecture?
Let me just start by saying, Valerie, there is plenty of finance capital out there. It's just not being directed to the right things at the right pace and reaching the right people. And I think this requires both dismantling a set of finances and subsidies and issues that are having a negative impact and investing in the right issue. That's for someone else to address. But that's not under be the illusion that there is not enough money out there. There clearly is. It's our ability to deliver it. And you're right. I mean, philanthropy has historically always done small projects here and there. And we are starting to see massive levels, including the pledge by Jeff Bezos, but many others. And all of that hasn't always been coordinated. So one of the things that we announced last year is that we took the investment that we were going to do, just to mention one initiative, for example, around what's called 30 by 30, the idea of protecting 30% of the planet by 2030, which is a key policy decision coming up in Montreal in 3 weeks. And we said, we're going to get behind this. We're going to put $1 billion of our capital in there, but we're also going to work with other donors in this space. And we leveraged it to get $5 billion that we've pledged together to do this. And now we're collaborating and aligning our funding toward this and discussing with the public funders ways that we can actually make this happen. I think that's one example of how we do it. We're also exploring other mechanisms of using it to de-risk some of their investments. And I think in the end, there are three things that the private philanthropy can probably do that are different. One is we can make sure it gets to the right places, to the right people. Take the case of indigenous peoples. Most of the funding that's pledged at these conferences never reaches the ground, and that's why there's a cry to get new mechanisms ready to do it. Second, it doesn't get there fast enough. Quite often, if you run an NGO, it will take you 3 years or 5 years to get a proposal approved. We need something that can move, and philanthropy can move in a matter of weeks. So we can be there at the front to help bridge this. And the last one is risk and innovation. We can take risk, we can innovate, we can do some things that are going to fail in a way that most multilateral banks are not willing to do. And I think that's something we need to do as well.
That idea around risk and innovation is an interesting one, and clearly philanthropic capital has always been at the forefront. But interestingly, Jason, recently the GEF has been getting involved in de-risking. Now, the GEF has never been known for being fast, and I say that coming from an institution who is also a little bit on the slow side. What have you been doing, and how have you been crowding in different finance to be able to leverage the GEF resources, the public grant resources, to go from millions to tens and hundreds of millions?
Excellent. And I think you hit on it. It's about the ecosystem of finance and sources of finance, if you will. So it's very clear that public finance will never get to the scale of the problem. So we have to be very strategic in how we deploy public finance, including through multilateral funds like the GEF, like the Green Climate Fund, like the Adaptation Fund, to be as strategic and catalytic as possible. So blended finance. How can we work together, for example, with philanthropy that can move very quick to do very first loss, very upstream, very high-risk investments? How can multilateral finance, like the GEF, come in behind to further de-risk, to further crowd in or attract private capital, which there isn't a shortage of, but needs to be supported to take the risks, to go into the dirty areas or the hard areas and hard to reach, the high risk from the perspective of finance populations and challenges.
Is it true, Zoe, is there not a shortage of private capital in this space? And what do you need from the public sector? What do you need from public financing or private philanthropic financing to get more of your money to play in this space?
Yeah, so I totally agree that there's enough capital. But I'm going to raise the word that nobody likes, which is bankable projects, and sort of acknowledgement of which projects really are purely philanthropic versus which projects are trying to be designed to generate a return. And there's a real distinction with that, right? And we haven't quite got a good framework to make that distinction. But the good news is, efforts like the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures and others will start to surface how our nature-based solutions and how they intertwine with each other to generate true value that contributes to sort of helping prevent the climate crisis and helping prevent environmental decline. The one thing that I would say, though, is that when we're thinking about this, one challenge is how you link nature and biodiversity to adaptation. And that's important because if we can get better at talking about that, we can map the nature and finance conversation into the climate one by looking at the NDCs. So Egypt has been particularly successful under its presidency of raising the NWEFI agenda, the nexus of energy, food and water, and driving an investment roadmap for its NDC to deliver the mitigation part of its climate plan. What we'd like to see a year or so from now is an adaptation roadmap and a linkage between the nature-based angle of adaptation, and that would help unlock the capital flows into that sort of direction of travel to solve the problem.
Alhamdou, you talked earlier about how important biodiversity is, not just because it's in crisis, not just because it's potentially a risk as it's disappearing for the communities left behind, but because it's a source of livelihood. It is capital for the poorest communities. And development banks, like the Africa Development Bank, exactly sit in between private sector and public sector in terms of trying to make sure that those livelihoods and those jobs and the small and medium-sized enterprises are formalized and aren't dependent upon grant financing or public financing forever. So what is the Africa Development Bank doing in terms of thinking about the types of other finance in this ecosystem that you could use to make sure that your bank's finances are made available, and in turn, you create private businesses that run on biodiversity but do it in a positive way?
The FDB has been already supporting biodiversity through our own development finance for several decades now. And we know that it's not enough given the scale of the needs that we are seeing from, in the countries that we are supporting. So, and I said earlier that development finance itself is not enough, but in order to attract other sources of finance, what AFDB is doing is that we use our development finance in a very smart and strategic way by also mobilizing, by using that to